My name is Gianluca, that's all that matters. I do two things in my professional life, mainly. One is teaching, particularly in executive education classrooms. So speaking with managers at various levels of leadership maturity. And the other one is I do research on things that I believe are relevant for successful leadership and to help us improve organizations and make them more effective. And when I was asked to give this open lecture, I had to think about what am I going to present, something that is closer to what I would do in an executive education classroom, or something that is closer to what I would do in a research seminar when I speak to other professors who do research in my area. And I decided to go for the latter route. It's a bit of a challenge, but I think it's important because I think one of the missions that we have as a school, which provides executive education, is to make sure that we bring the conversation on leadership to a high level, that we contribute to elevating that conversation to the point of being evidence-based and rooted in serious empirical research. I think the field of leadership is a field that has grown tremendously with all kinds of positive developments in it, and also a few developments that are not necessarily beneficial, because not all of the leadership material that we find out there is rooted in research. So I would like to make a point by presenting some of the work my co-authors and I do on the research side of what I then teach in an executive education classroom. I think it's important to sort of lift the curtain a little bit and show you a bit of the back-end work of what we do when we do research on leadership. Now, today, the topic that I would like to talk about is innovation. Innovation in a very broad sense. Innovation in the sense of people inside an organization bringing in new ideas that are valuable to the organization, that make that organization more adaptive, more flexible. One would say, using today's terminology, more agile. And we know that employees in all organizations vary quite dramatically in the extent to which they're able to provide this sort of bottom-up innovation into their organization. Some of our colleagues are really great at it. They have a deep ability to come up with new ideas, connecting dots that nobody else sees how to connect, and then championing these new ideas inside the organization and making things change, inducing positive change inside the organization. Others are less active in this respect. And it's crucial for us to try and understand why is it that some of these employees are agents of change and innovations and others are not? How can we explain this variance? Why is this so relevant? Because ultimately, organizations have become such complex machines that most of the really interesting new ideas no longer come from the top. They come from the bottom. And of course, they've got to be directed and guided, but a lot of the new ideas are coming from the bottom up with employees whose knowledge is quite deep in their competence area, who try to find new connections between ideas, find new ways to produce new services or new products that were not there in the market, find new ways to organize internal processes in more efficient or effective ways. So that's the underlying motivation for the study. And when we look at this question, the academic literature really tends to have two quite different approaches. There's one side that says this table is either I need to move on or the table back. I'll go for the. So the literature tends to have one of two different approaches on this. One says, to simplify things, thank you, Molly, innovation, creativity really is inside the individual. You either have it or you don't. Some of us are creative. Some of us are motivated to bring about creativity in the organization. Others aren't. Now, if that's your theory, and there's quite some evidence in favor of this theory, if that's your theory, then leadership really doesn't matter that much. You just need to hire the right people, and they'll bring about innovation. But there's another line of thinking, and in fact, the second line of thinking collects at least as much evidence in favor of it, and it's a lot more interesting for us because we can work with that. That second line of thinking says, your individual level traits, the kind of character you have, the kind of personality you have, all of those things matter, but what really matters most is the kind of network of relationships you build around yourself. Innovativeness largely is a function of the information you receive and the information you process inside the workplace, and that information largely reflects the network structure around you. It's not an individual level property, it's a matter of how do you build relationships around you such that you expose yourself to ideas, perspectives that you can then combine creatively. Now, to me, this latter approach is far more interesting because we can work with that. And it's very rooted in empirical research. There's a lot of evidence in favor of this idea. And today, what I would like to present is what is it's an empirical test of what is probably the most interesting part of this theory. It's called structural holes theory. I'll explain in a minute what it is. And it's simply a theory that says organizations are typically, they look like this. If you had an X-ray scan of the organization in which you work, I promise that it would look something like that. Maybe much bigger or smaller, depending on the size of your organization. But most organizations have exactly that structure once you look not at the organization chart, but at the company behind the organization chart. The invisible organization that exists in all companies and that essentially consists of informal relations. In this particular case, we're looking specifically at informal relations of advice exchange. Who do you go to when you need to get advice about how to best proceed in your job? And who comes to you to ask for advice when they need to proceed, when they need to go on with their job? Each of us has our preferred colleagues where we would go to. We don't pick our colleagues at random. When we have advice to ask, we'll select where we go. Now, this tends to develop over time to the point that our network solidifies around us. Now, what's interesting is that once this network is there, once it takes that particular shape, then most of the relevant information that circulates inside the organization will go through that network. What goes through the organization chart are the decisions that are already made. But when the decisions are being made, when new ideas are being explored, when opportunities are being evaluated, when threats are being assessed, the information typically comes from this network. So where you are in that network matters enormously for how useful you can be in producing new ideas that improve your organization. And this is what we're going to look at. If you look at the structure, this is a characteristic cluster and bridge structure. And all organizations have it. You can try to slice your organization as you wish. IBM at some point had 16 dimensions in their matrix, which probably generated more schizophrenia than benefits. But even then, even if you have so many dimensions in a matrix, ultimately the organization will tend to have these cluster and bridge structures, where a lot of the information circulates inside relatively closed clusters, but very little of it circulates across these clusters. We could call these clusters silos if we want. That's the intuition behind it. And what have we learned about this? A bunch of really interesting things, but the one we're going to look at today is that if you try to explain who in this organization, where each dot you see is an individual person, Who is going to be more innovative? Who is going to bring in more valuable new ideas that improve the organization's success, that make it more adaptive? Those are systematically the people who broker between the clusters, who somehow manage to position themselves in a way where they're not only exposed to their own cluster's information, they're not only asking and receiving advice, sometimes on a confidential basis, from within their own silo, but they're structurally open to engaging with people from another silo or from multiple other silos. It turns out that these yellow people here are bringing about most of the positive changes that happen in organizations, and that most of the positive changes, innovations that they bring about are not only benefiting their own individual performance, but they're benefiting the performance of the overall organization. If you want, you can think about it with a counterfactual, we would say, to use a word from research methodology. Imagine that these people, the yellow people right here, tomorrow, well, we could take a dramatic version of it or a less dramatic one. Let me take the less dramatic one. They fall sick, mildly, and they don't show up anymore at the organization, or they go to another employer. They decide to leave the company and go somewhere else. What would happen to the organization? Try to imagine what would happen to that organization. Those bridging relationships that are there are severed suddenly. The organization doesn't even recognize that this is happening because it's impossible to see these relationships. And yet the system becomes far more fragmented and information stops circulating across the silos. That prevents all kinds of really important things from happening. The organization becomes progressively more rigid, less agile, less adaptive, and innovation becomes a lot less important or less productive. So what we want to do is, given that we know that these people are the ones who tend to become particularly innovative, given that we know that these yellow relationships here are so important, what we want to study here in this particular research piece is, can everybody do that job? Or do you really need to be a creative in the first place? Can we teach people to build this kind of relationships, given that this kind of relationships are so important for the organization, that they are the channel, the conduit of innovation? And that's what we do in this particular study. We know from existing research that these people are doing very well, but here, this particular study will look at the causality of the argument. Let me first spell out the argument very quickly for you. The theory, structural holes theory, is very simple. It says an employee's innovative performance, so the extent to which a person will be able to bring about positive innovations that are valuable to the organization, is a function of how many structural holes, let me say silos, that individual learns to broker via these informal relationships. People who have more informal relationships across structural holes, across the silos, will progressively become more innovative and will improve the innovativeness of the organization. That's what the theory says. Why is that so? Because information, opinions, perspective tend to become very homogeneous within each cluster. So if you position yourself at the juncture between these clusters, you are exposed to very different sources of information, very different ways of looking at things. And you're the only one who sees both or all three ways of looking at that particular problem. That is the source of creativity, and that is the source of synergies that you can create by breaking down these silos. Okay? Now, what evidence do we have from the past? The evidence we have from the past is that, yes, there is an empirical correlation. If you have many of those ties, you tend to be more innovative and your organization performs better. However, if we want to be serious about it, that evidence is not compelling. Why? First, there's a problem of what we call reverse causality. It might well be that you are creative, And because you are creative, people come to you and they try to form relationships with you. They come and ask advice to you. They come from multiple silos because you are so creative. Now, if that's the story, it's still interesting to know, but there's not a lot that we can do. Where again, back to theory one, it's all about the creativity of the individual. Leadership really doesn't matter. There's another problem. We call that technically unobserved heterogeneity. It is possible that because I am more creative, because I am better, because my performance is generally higher, I will sort myself into those positions. I will simply try to occupy those positions because I know that that's beneficial for myself. Okay? Now, we want to have a design with this research where we get rid of these two problems and we prove the causality of the argument. We want to show, or we want to test, if building these new ties that cross the holes really improves people's innovative performance, regardless of who they are. Okay? So the approach we're going to take is a little bit the same as what people do in science. That is, imagine you're testing a drug. You want to see if this drug is effective. How would you do this? You run an experiment. You give that drug to a randomly assigned section of your population, and then you have a placebo group and a control group. We'll do exactly the same, except that we cannot have the placebo group. And I'll explain in a second why. But that's essentially exactly what we're doing with this study. We designed what is called a field experiment. A field experiment is an experiment, so it's based on randomization. It's based on the golden standard of science, but it does not happen in the lab. It happens inside a real organization. Why? Because it's difficult to fabricate in a lab a relationship between individuals. It's just impossible, in fact. So the best way to go at it is you take an organization, a real organization, where people have their own relationships already, and then you treat half of these people who are randomly assigned to the treatment, trying to induce in them a tendency to form these bridging ties. And to the other half, you do nothing. You leave them as they are. They continue to live their normal life. So we did this in the business unit of an American company, which is a leading semiconductor company, and they have one of the most interesting pieces of it is in Italy, where I come from, where they're using a very innovative technology, and it's a business unit with a pretty intense R&D investment. But there are people who are not all in the R&D department. We're looking at the entire organization, or the entire business unit. It's a very small business unit. I do a lot of research using big data, and I love it. But when you try to test the causality of things, especially if you want to be in contact with real organizations and real relationships, sometimes it's best to go with a magnifying lens in a particular place, even though that's small. That's the approach we've taken here. It's a business unit that has roughly 170 points over the observation period, so the period over which we collected the data. We've observed this business unit for 2.5 years. And we've done a lot of work with them to make sure that we understood exactly how this organization functions, including collecting all kinds of qualitative evidence. About 1/4 of the organization is women. We'll see that that's an interesting piece of information. What is the drug we used? The treatment. The treatment is we assigned half of this organization to an executive education module on the benefits of building these relationships. And in this executive education module, the length of which is a full day, we explained essentially two things. We're slow in teaching, probably. 2 messages only in the full day. Morning, there's a lot of advantages in building these bridging relationships across the silos. Organizations look like this. If you manage to build these relationships, there's all kinds of advantages that come with it. Message number 2, which we focused on in the afternoon, building those relationships is tremendously difficult. Here are the tactics that we have learned work very well, and here are the tactics that we have learned work very poorly. So we explained and we gave them the motivation to build these bridging relationships and at the same time the tools to build these bridging relationships. And we did this only with half of the population, as we said, randomly selected. Okay? That's the treatment you used. Here's the timeline. There are 4 main times at which we collect data. The response rate is always very high throughout the whole observation period. The number of employees changes a little bit because there are people who come and go. Over 2.5 years' time, that's normal. There's about 6 months between each observation period. And the intervention, the treatment, happens here, between time 2 and time 3. Okay? So here we observe the organization as it evolves naturally. Same here. Then we make the intervention, randomized intervention, and then we collect again the same data here and the same data here. The data is very extensive. We know pretty much everything about everyone in that organization. And we can model that in our estimations. These are the networks before and after, just to give you a visual impression. You can't really see much from these networks, but these networks are mathematical objects. We can do very sophisticated analysis about each and everything that happens in there, and that's what we have done. So how do we assess causality? Here, I'll go through it quickly. It's a bit painful, but I promise I'll go quickly. What we want to see methodologically is that the randomized treatment, the day of executive education we gave them, has an effect on these people's ability to build bridging ties, and that these new bridging ties that they have formed affect the person's innovative performance. Ideally, the experiment doesn't have a direct relationship here. Okay? We really want to see that the treatment changed these people's networks by inducing them to reach across the silos, and that these exogenously generated networks, which have the ties that have been generated through the treatment, are improving the person's innovative performance. That would be the cleanest possible way to prove causality. We're also controlling for these people innovative performance before the treatment was assigned, as well as for their network structure before the treatment was assigned. So we're controlling for pretty much everything. If we find evidence here, that's very compelling evidence that there is a causal effect. And we do. We find there's no reason to go into the details of these parameters, but the fact that these parameters are positive means that the treatment changed significantly people's position in the network. Those who received the treatment moved towards a more bridging position. They started to build bridging ties across the silos more, significantly more, than those who did not take the treatment. And what you see here is the evidence that those newly built bridging ties, now 1 year after the treatment, 6 months after the bridging ties emerging, impact positively on those employees' innovative performance, not as assessed by themselves, but by others in the organization. I know this may sound weird, but this is to me about the most exciting thing I could get. This is real evidence that there's an effect. This effect is out there, it's causal, and it stays. It sticks with people over a relatively long period of time. This is the first time that we're able to demonstrate something like this. We also thought, does it really work for everybody? And we checked a bunch of differences. And one that I think is especially important is, does it work in exactly the same way for men and women? There's a bunch of things we have tested. One of them is gender. Why? Because there's lots of evidence to show that women have disadvantages in the workplace. So here we have a rare case in which we have a causally tested effect. If we can see if that works differently for men and women, again, that's compelling evidence. It's no blah, blah. So we tested that. And what do you think the answer is? Yes, it does. And it does in the following way. It turns out that women who have been treated, so women who have been part of the executive education module, are equally likely as men are to build bridging relationships as a reflection of that executive education module. They do react to the module exactly the same way the men do, in fact, even a bit more. The difference is not statistically significant. But in fact, women tend to build even more bridging ties than men do after taking the executive education module. However, this effect disappears entirely. So by the time that women try to convert that particular bridge that they have built into an advantage, that doesn't work. What does this suggest? It suggests that women are not different from men in how they build relationships. In fact, if anything, they're slightly more capable than men are. But it also suggests that once you start to sort of collect benefits out of those relationships, take the ideas that are coming through those relationships, combine them in novel ways, promote them towards your supervisor or towards the other department, try to connect the dots the way that these people typically do. In that phase, women face a greater hurdle relative to men. Okay, so we're now funneling down to where exactly the gender effect is happening. The effect disappears entirely for women. For women, taking executive education module changes their network structure, but not their performance. Most of the performance effect is in men's hands. This clearly signals we've got to work on this. Okay? All right, to conclude, what have we learned from this study? Finding number one, it is true, structural holes theory is correct. Building these bridging relationships across the silos has a clear causal effect on people's innovativeness, and that is reflected in how much they contribute to the organization. We have to teach people to learn, to build more bridging ties across the silos. That's the obvious implication. That makes them more productive, it makes their organization more agile, more adaptive, more innovative. It's not only a matter of hiring the right people, it's also a matter of teaching them to relate across the silos. Finding number two, the magnitude of this effect is very different for men than it is for women. For men, it's a very strong effect. For women, it kind of disappears altogether. Again, this does not mean we shouldn't teach women how to build these bridging ties, because they know how to do it just as well as men do. We probably should teach men how to receive ideas from women once they have built those ties. Finding number three, I think this is also quite interesting. A single day of executive education is enough to change people's networks inside the organization and to affect significantly their innovative performance, the extent to which they contribute to the organization with novel ideas that make the organization better. So there's a lot of talking about evidence-based management, evidence-based leadership, and there's very little of it. This is a rare case in which I think we can proudly say this is stuff we can teach in class. We must teach it in class. We've got to bring it to the executives. We have to bring it to the managers. We have to teach even at the master level with the younger generations what networks do, how they change the way in which you think, how they can make you more productive, how bringing these boundaries between the silos down can be excellent for your own performance as well as for the performance of the organization. So on this note, I would like to thank you very much and open up the floor for questions and discussions. Yes, please.
Have you looked at differences in innovative performance depending on the structure of the firm in the first place? So for example, you're talking about silos a lot. If you have cross-functional staffing, does that improve innovative performance because silos necessarily have to break down at some point, or the exchange and the bridge building has to happen in a way?
So that's a very good question. In all honesty, we are unable to look at that question with this study. That would require another study, and it's a complicated one to design. But we do have evidence that relates to that question. We've done micro-level analysis. Let me not get into the details of it, but we've created two different ways to help people build new bridging ties. One is we simply gave them the knowledge that this is useful and this is how you do it best. The second thing we did is we created opportunities for them to interact. We literally brought them together, people who we knew were not connected because they belong to different silos, because we have that information from the past network observations. We brought them together inside the same room, and we gave them problem-solving tasks of a cross-functional nature. And we had them work. It was only a few hours, so nothing that you could say it's the same as a real cross-functional project, but nevertheless, that's what we've tried to do. And then we empirically looked at what is the effect of giving them knowledge versus what is the effect of giving them an opportunity to interact. And we see that almost all of the effect we have is in the knowledge side. So forcing people to be together in our data is not enough to have them build these bridging ties or benefit from these bridging ties. But telling people, explaining to people, giving them a broader vision for why building these ties is useful has a very positive effect. What I suspect this is leading to, that's really something I would like to put my hands on at some point in the future, is the idea that people are clever, that they should decide on their own who they need to bridge a tie with or build a bridging tie with. If you tell people, hey, why don't you, Gianluca, connect with somebody else there because it's useful, I will probably not find it to be as beneficial as if you tell me, hey, Gianluca, why don't you explore that silo and find your own ways to relate to somebody there. I have that local knowledge where I can figure out with that person it wouldn't work. I don't think that's the right combination for me. But alone, I can make my own decisions and explore. That's, I think, but this is only speculative, what the data is suggesting.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Now, I must have missed something, because at the core of your presentation is the question of how you increase innovativeness, but how you measure innovativeness in the first place. Isn't that not correlated to the question of where you are in the company, much more than whether you are a man or a woman? Isn't that, depending on the sector, are there hundreds of different parameters which play a role in order to measure correctly innovativeness?
Absolutely right. This is totally correct. Now, there's two sides to your question. One, we can address quite satisfactorily. We control for people's position inside the organization. We have full information about what each of them is doing, what formal authority he or she has over what business, and we control for that. So we take that away from our own estimations. Now, the other part of the question is harder to address. How do you measure innovation for people who are doing different kinds of work? The way that innovation has been measured over the past 20 years, really, with improvements, is actually pretty simple. We go inside organizations and we ask colleagues to assess a particular person's innovativeness with respect to an array of different behaviors. And the colleagues will know what the particular person is doing and will assess based on that if, given that role, this person's behaviors, attitudes, ideas are innovative. It is not perfect. It is far from perfect. Nevertheless, this is the best we can do, and this is what organizations do as well when they're trying to measure the innovativeness of their employees. I also have another line of research. This is part of the big data side of my research, where we measure innovativeness in much more objective ways. And that we can only do by taking a very homogeneous group, so particularly the R&D department. And then we will look at very sophisticated patent information to see exactly how each of these R&D members contributes to innovations that are economically valuable. So see, that's a different approach. Here we have the objectivity of a measurement that is economically valuable. But the drawback is we've got to take a very homogeneous group, which essentially means you're not able to test the theory correctly. So your argument is very well taken, your point is very well taken. The measurement is not perfect, but it's as perfect as we can get it, and it's very similar to what organizations would do when measuring people's innovative performance. It's their supervisors get to assess them. Yeah. Peter.
How does this behavior link to the incentive of the company, right? Because I
So first of all, the silos are not necessarily a function of the incentives of the organization. The silos are a function of how human societies develop. So even in informal organizations, you'll see that this kind of structure develops anyways. We like it to be embedded in a close clique. It just feels better. You get the psychological warmth, you get a local culture where you understand others and others understand you. That's a very natural development, and that's why it is so hard to get rid of silos inside organizations, because people need this kind of closure. We all do. That said, those boundaries, which are largely invisible, they can be made more or less permeable, and that's where organizations can operate. I think for many years, organizations have tried to make that change by primarily brute force, by stuffing people in cross-functional teams. I've got nothing against that. Or by creating a matrix structure. I've got nothing against that. But it was a top-down approach. What I think this study hints at is that we should complement that approach by taking a more bottom-up strategy, where we explain to people the beauty of crossing silos. There's nothing that is more inspiring and enlightening than confronting yourself with people who do not understand what you're doing or why you're doing it. That is a major learning experience. And it's a learning experience that you can do inside your organization just like outside your organization. It's being an outsider creates huge learning opportunities. So if we help people understand how great these opportunities are and give them the tools to cross the silos on their own, as opposed to forcing them on them, I think these boundaries will become progressively more permeable. And in organizations that do this, you see the effect. The boundaries are more permeable in certain organizations. That is the direction that I suggest we should take, at least as an attempt in the future. Yes, please.
Very interesting, your remarks and your research. From the experience in the corporate world, I have the following observation and question. I fully agree with your result, and I'm in fact, as a board member of ESMT, delighted that the executive education has such an enormous effect, and this is something we obviously should spread around the corporate world in Germany. However, my experience is, and that is a little bit of a frustration. Typically, in corporations, you either send people to ESMT, to open enrollment programs, you have your corporate universities, you have other offsites where you, of course, teach bringing down the silos, try to work across silos, be innovative, and so on. And this is all incredibly engaging. And people come home from those events full of energy, and the next couple of days, they are really talking across. But then the day-to-day work comes in. Yeah. The overload, special projects, so they have absolutely no idea anymore that they wanted to be crossing silos. They are back in their day-to-day work. How can you make those educational successes you were just reporting? How can you make them sustainable, and what do you have to do?
Yeah, this is another excellent point. And I don't want to, I think what you're pointing to is a very evident challenge. And I don't think that this study shows we can easily overcome that challenge. I think it's a very serious one. What happens when people go back, that may be also related to what Peter had in mind, when people go back to their normal environment, then going back to your habits is obviously the most natural thing to do. And also in your workplace, you are often under a lot of pressure from people who may not necessarily see the benefits of you crossing certain boundaries inside your organization. Some people might even feel challenged or threatened by this kind of behaviors. And more or less implicitly, this creates a situation where people revert back to, why don't I stay inside my own silo? I know that it's going to work if I do that. Whereas venturing outside and breaking the silos really, there's a lot of risk involved in it. So your point is very well taken. My view, and again, here we're entering, this is pure speculation. There's no hard evidence for it. But the way I think about it is, the notion of continuous learning is something we should take more seriously. If we see that there's an effect after over a year for somebody who took 1 day of executive education, and this effect changed the structure of the very organization, not only where you are, but the very structure of the organization was altered in a positive way. If we see that a single day of executive education can do that, then I'm tempted to say, let's make the investment to realize that you have to continuously inject new knowledge, that you have to continuously engage with learning new things, that this is part of your job, that it's not something like you take a degree once and you're done. I don't think organizations are going to go very far if that's the way we take it. So in a sense, I think the only answer I can offer to your point is, I guess the solution would probably have to be that we have to accept education is not about a one-time shot where you get a title for something. It really is about engaging and being open to continuously learn new things. So if in a year from now you start to revert back to your usual silo, that's probably because you have not been open to other things in the meantime, and you have not challenged yourself with exploring new areas of knowledge, and you're just accepting that you'll progressively revert back to being a less innovative individual. But if we continuously inject knowledge in people, that's the asset of our organizations. It's knowledge. People have their brains already, their processors work extremely well, but we've got to fuel those processes with knowledge that they use productively and guide them in that direction. I think that is probably something we have to do on a continuous basis, as opposed to thinking about just one-shot investments. Cheng Wei.
Very interesting finding. Thank you very much. My question actually is related to the previous one. So let me ask differently. Did you have a chance to present this result to this participant? Were they surprised, particularly the female participant?
I did not present the results to the participants because this was part of the original agreement, that this was going to be an experiment, and therefore it should not affect people's position inside the organization in any possible way. This was part of the ethical guidelines and agreements that we signed. What I did do is I discussed general level results with the leadership of the organization. For example, I did point out and have a quite lengthy discussion with the general manager and even the CEO of that organization about the gender effect. And the discussion was quite interesting because now we weren't talking about, oh, women are penalized in the workplace, everybody knows that. But we were talking about something that was very specific, very sort of on a magnifying lens. It forces you to think about, and how exactly would that play out? How exactly is it that we create that disadvantage? And I thought I hope that was useful. But no, we did not present the results to the population studied for the agreement that I just described. But if we publish the paper, the results will be out.
There is still time. I just follow on my
Absolutely.
previous. Obviously, you could think about that. The solution for my problem is that you are organizing, because when you were talking about silos are virtually nothing else than the effect of a organizational structure decision you have made, because you have just simply developed departments, and departments are traditionally physically together and apart from the other department. So would a potential solution be that, like the Google campus, that you are not putting your people anymore according to departments physically together, but that you are forcing them to really mingle and mix, i.e. therefore also having conversations, you force them to have those cross-silo discussions, because the guy who sits next to you is not in your department, but in a completely different department. I mean, is there in the research, in the science, is there any evidence for this enhancing innovation? I mean, Google most probably has done it because of that.
This is good intuition. Yes, there is evidence. It's obviously not this study, it's other studies. I am not one of the authors, but there is evidence that the physical location in which you place people will have, over a few months' time, a very powerful effect on the network that they develop. They haven't been able in that research to then establish the causality of, okay, but what do those new ties do to the performance of these individuals and groups? Because again, one thing is if I see opportunities and connect the dots on my own, then I have that entrepreneurial spirit that is guiding me where opportunities reside. Another thing is if we, from the top down, without having that local knowledge, place people close together, they will develop relationships. Are they going to be the most productive relationships? That we do not know. It's likely to be beneficial, but we don't have that bit of evidence specifically. Companies have tried, some companies like Google, to create these spaces where people mingle from different areas. That cannot hurt. That can only do good things. I completely agree that that is probably one of the things that we should do more. I do insist on, we also have to explain to people why that would be a good idea. So one of the things that we're learning more and more is that if you tell people what they have to do without giving them the broader picture of why that matters to them individually, then people will simply not act on the opportunities they have. But if we work with people to build a culture where they see the vision, the broader vision, okay, we're trying to build a company that becomes more adaptive by permeating these boundaries. Here's how the company would, looks like if you only could see it. This is a network. This is our network, and you can act on it and change it. Now they have the broader picture. They will act on their opportunities a lot more. So I would think about a combined approach of creating opportunities for interaction, maybe also via physical space. Also, however, giving people information, knowledge, the broader picture of why it would make sense, because ultimately, that's the energy that we need to elicit. It's people's own entrepreneurial decisions to move and make connections.
Thank you, Gianluca. This comment actually just made me think, do you think that coming back to the gender effect of women being very good in forming relationships and being comparable to men, that if they were maybe placed in a different organizational unit, then innovation would maybe increase? Because if I understand correctly, innovation was measured according to feedback from the same environment. And we know that innovation needs to be nurtured. There needs to be certain autonomy. There needs to be freedom to act. So maybe innovation could have occurred if they had moved after building these ties and networks, be put in a different place in an organization to then perform.
Yeah, or if they had built those bridging ties in an organization that was less male-dominated. As I said, there's 1/4 of the organizational population who is women. 3/4 are men. What that means is, even trivially, the ones who write about you, the ones who give you feedback about how innovative you have been, largely are men. So we don't really know if it could all be a matter of your colleagues' interpretation of your innovative ideas is more negative if you're a woman. We cannot nail that yet, but it could just be that. Now, on the general theoretical question, if you were in an organization that's female-dominated, you would obtain the opposite result. I am completely certain of it. Men would tend to be the underrepresented constituency, and that will tend to be associated with greater penalties. Now, the issue, therefore, is that in most of our organizations, the ones who make the real decisions are largely men. The ones who constitute the role model for what success is are largely men. And they don't need to be male chauvinists. It's good people like us who understand perfectly well that it would be wonderful if there were gender parity, even in these subtle dimensions. It's not the macho men anymore that constitutes a problem in organizations. It's the associations with what is the role model that succeeds. Those associations that people make in their mind that matter. So there are differences to how men and women bring about their innovative ideas. There are differences in how men and women look. There are differences in how they relate to one another. There are differences in how people perceive the very same behavior by a man and the very same behavior by a woman. There's lots of experimental evidence on this. So for example, brokering this silos requires that you entrepreneurially make connections. You go to a person from one silo, collect ideas, you come up with a bright idea. Why we could actually do that with this particular group, and you go talk. That's a very entrepreneurial approach. There's experimental evidence to show that when women engage in entrepreneurial behaviors such as this one, they tend to be labeled as arrogant. When men engage in the same kind of behaviors, this is experimental, so it's perfectly controlled, those same behaviors are interpreted as assertive. That's the difference. That's the difference. So it could be this slight, nuanced differences that really matter here. But if you were in a female-dominated environment, the relationship would very likely revert. Because it's a cultural effect. It's not a biological effect. So go up to the board and populate it with more women.
Gianluca, thanks very much. I have about 6 questions, but I'll ask just the one. Do you have any sense for at what point the network efficiency would be saturated with these informal connections such that the cost to the business then starts exceeding the net benefit that's being realized?
Again, we're going beyond this particular study, but there's a general understanding that, let me say, every organization will have the formal structure and then an informal structure behind it, and organizations differ in the extent to which the formal structure matters relative to the informal structure, right? So if you take Google, the informal structure, to make a simple example, the informal structure plays a huge role. The formal structure plays a more limited role. If you take, a more traditional organization, then the opposite will tend to be true. Now, what we have learned is that the extent to which we want to invest in the informal organization, as opposed to the formal one, has a lot to do with how knowledge-intensive and change-prone the organization needs to be in order to succeed. Companies that are more knowledge-intensive and where continuous change is more of a requirement, they need to invest more in permeable boundaries where informal relationships really drive the whole show. And there, it's difficult to overinvest in that sense. Companies that are more traditional, based on routine type tasks, they will need less of that. The trend is clearly going in the direction of needing more agility, even in traditional sectors. So if I had to guess, we're probably at a stage on average where we're under-investing in this informal dynamics rather than over-investing.
Thank you for your presentation. My question was, during your research, have you encountered the cases when there was reluctancy to innovation? And if there were such cases, what were the reasons behind individuals doing it, and how would you ensure that the reluctancy to innovation was to be reduced?
Just to make sure, the first part of the question is if I looked at individual resistance to... so there are certain personality traits that turn out to be correlated with this, which interestingly are not related to creativity. But there's a personality trait which is called self-monitoring. It's the ease with which people relate to situations and people who are different from what they are and can change very rapidly. That's called self-monitoring. It turns out we developed self-monitoring really early on in our upbringing. Some psychologists even claim it's partly genetically determined. We don't know if that's true. We found that if you are a high self-monitor, so somebody who thrives in environments where there's a lot of diversity and where situations change very rapidly, then you take the most out of the executive education day. If you're a low self-monitor, you will be taking less advantage of it. Both, however, have a benefit. So it's not much reluctance in the sense of, I don't believe the story, but rather reluctance in the sense of, to some of us, it's just simply, it comes more natural to be an outsider, to hang out with people who are different from what we are, to be ready for situations that are unusual and these kind of things. And that turns out to be a predictor in this. Good. So I think we had a very lively discussion. I'm very thankful for all the wonderful feedback. Lots of ideas you guys gave me. I will certainly take the best of it and try to bring it to my next research. So thanks a lot for coming, and enjoy the rest of the day.